and a researcher at the MIT Open Documentary Lab. And through her work, Abby considers the power dynamics in the documentary form's inherent smudging of reality, with a particular interest in the conditions of moving image exhibition. As you can tell from her bio, all of her discussions are incredibly insightful and heady. So I'm so excited to welcome the incomparable Abby Sen to introduce the rest of the panelists and this session. Abby?
Thank you so much, Sapna, for that very flattering introduction. Before I get started, I also have a couple of folks to thank, Patty and Tisha, for doing our ASL interpretation today, Keisha, my co-conspirator and the co-founder of Sentient Art Film, for inviting me into this space, for co-curating my site 1990s Asian American film and video, without which none of this, the panels, all of the activities that we've been doing would be possible. You see in chat posting all of the information about what's going on today is the series coordinator for Line of Sight and for My Sight is Lined with. And we also wouldn't be here without the rest of the Sentient team, Rahel, Caroline, Matt. Thank you so much. This Line of Sight series of panels is supported by Caam. So thank you to the entire Caam team, but especially to Don Young. So for today, I just wanted to let everybody know we will be looking at chat. So please say hello to all of us. Let us know your thoughts as you're listening. We will also be using the Q&A function on the right side of your screen for taking questions, and I will be incorporating any questions that come in the course of our conversation. We will also have a more dedicated Q&A time at the end, but please don't hesitate. Let us know if you have any questions or things that you want to on at any point during the panel. So I'm going to really quickly try to introduce themed panelists. All of them have been working for decades in this space, so it would take the entire time to fully explicate all where they've been, who they have been supporting, but I will try to keep it brief because we want to get straight into the meat of this conversation. This panel and all of the work that we'll be talking about during it would not be possible without the work of Daryl Chen. He is critic and curator, was the managing editor of Film Culture magazine, the associate editor of Performing Arts Journal from the 70s and 80s. But this space, he is one of the co-founders of the Asian American International Film Festival, now known as Asian Cinevision. He was also on the New Fest, Apparatus Production, and himself is an accomplished theater performance artist. He's written essays in anthologies, in film journals, general film criticism, and has supported many experimental filmmakers from the 70s, 80s, and on. We also have Meena Nanji with us today. Hi, Daryl. Thanks for joining us. An award-winning filmmaker who has played films of hers from the experimental to slightly more conventional at many Asian American festivals. She's programmed film and video festivals, guest lectured at universities, has co-founded some arts of Asian and Asian American, also Middle Eastern cinema, and has introduced them into LA, into spaces. She's also produced films for public broadcasting here in the US, as well as for Channel 4 and RAI in on a feature documentary about the legacy of colonialism in Kenya and the ongoing struggle for land, Kenya being her own birth. Thank you, Meena, for joining us. And finally, our third panelist for today is Brian Hu, the artist movement who present the San Diego Asian Film Festival. He's also an assistant professor at San Diego State University, has written monograph on cinema in Hong Kong and Taiwan from the 1950s to the aughts, and has, like Daryl, in film journals and general film criticism. Brian is someone who is instrumental to how I have conceived the potential of programming Asian American works. So I'm extraordinarily delighted to have him with us today. But I want to give just one of the more kind of general pop culture things that he does, which is being one of the co-hosts of the podcast Saturday School, which is in I don't even know how many seasons it's been at this point. It's been many seasons, and I've been listening to Brian chat about Asian American feature films, about their political implications, and making it super incredibly fun. All a huge improvement over the Sunday school, Chinese school that I attended as a child. So if anyone has any lasting trauma from school learning languages and about heritage, I highly recommend this podcast. Y'all again. I'm going to start us off because the description for this panel is framed around the recent resurgence. This is my interpretation, and we'll discuss whether or not my interpretation is correct in this panel, of the work of one particular experimental writer, Theresa. And what I noticed was that her work was being read in many disparate spaces last year, from memorials after the tragic Atlanta shootings to experimental film programs around the world. This was especially programs that I was seeing from Europe and in countries where there were diasporic communities of filmmakers of Asian descent. So short excerpt from Dictée, her 1981 experimental poetry novel. In Dictée, why resurrect it all now from the past? History, the past emotions all over again, to confess to live the same folly, to name it now so as not to repeat oblivion, to extract each fragment by each fragment from the word, from the image, another word, another image, the reply that history in oblivion. So with that in mind, I'm going to start us all off by asking, what is the 80s? Is it a living fragment? Why is it important to you in your practice, if it is important, the past and how we talk about it? Daryl, can we start with you?
Well, I think that, yes, especially during the past year, for better or worse, I think a lot of us have been going back and looking at things that have happened and how they developed in this particular year. That's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, I wanted to have Brian included in this discussion, because let's put it this way. This year was a very, very significant year for Asian American filmmaking on all levels. I mean, in terms of independent films, in terms of the industry, and of course it would happen during the pandemic year. You know, it's like, yeah, that's just our luck. It's like at a time when there was greater visibility for Asian American filmmakers, that would be the year when everybody had to stay home. And it prompted the idea of why this development was sort of ongoing. It has been ongoing. Certainly in the last decade, I've noticed that there were always very interesting independent films that were being made by Asian Americans. And in many cases, they were not being presented in a way that framed the work in terms of a sort of more general outlook in terms of whether there was a sort of Asian American aesthetic and all these other things. It was like, it was very much people working independently, often in regional sort of formats, people working in Texas, in the Midwest, a lot of people finding resources by pooling together with other filmmakers. And so that was, I think, very interesting. And so it really did flower within the last 2 years. But as I said, of course, it would happen during the pandemic year, when there were no theaters available and most people were stuck at home. And so it's like, did it actually happen? And so that brings us to the idea of when these sort of developments keep going, and how in the 80s, for example, there really started to be a lot of activity in Asian American filmmaking. And once again, a lot of it by 1990 was very marginalized. Okay.
I could talk about kind of my thoughts on Asian American film in the 1980s, especially experimental. I mean, first of all, like coming from film studies, the 80s aren't really usually considered history. About like film history, we're talking about like the 1930s or 40s, and so the thing about Asian American cinema in the 80s as history, I think, is itself a kind of a different way of looking at this body of work. When you look at the studies of films from that period, and including the 90s too, they're usually written in sort of in the present tense. We're thinking about like Peter Fang's work. And so why is it important to look at the 80s as history? I think part of it is in terms of thinking about it in relation with an archive, and that's important to think about these as not objects that we can find the same way that we would films from the 2000s, like say on Netflix or via streaming or even on a DVD. And so I think it's important to think about the 80s as history, because it requires us to use a different kind of investigation to find it, and to keep these films alive. That's part of the project of Saturday School too. And so part of me, like why I love looking at these films, is to think about them like that the materiality is different, the channels of distribution are different, and then suddenly to be able to tell the stories of how these films were produced and circulated. I think that's what interests me about this period now.
I guess as a practitioner of sorts, and when I started making videos, it was in the early 90s. From out of CalArts, I did not consider myself a filmmaker or video artist or anything before I went to art school as a graduate student. But I think in terms of, is the past important or worth remembering? Of course it is. I mean, of course, we all grow out of certain circumstances that came before us. And whether we think we landed on this planet with this awareness or knowledge, without referring the past, we do breathe it in through the cultural context. But also, you know, for me being at CalArts, I mean, I learned so much from most of my very feminist professors who were really introducing works made in the 50s, 60s, 70s to me that I could then build on, right? So if that work didn't exist, it would be reinventing the wheel to some extent. But I think we all, you know, we're all informed by different facets, whether it's film or books or, you know, whatever it is, but it's so incredibly, you know, it's incredibly important to build on, you know, what's come before, and take the conversation forward, which I find is happening now. I think it's kind of amusing to me that I'm sort of, you know, my work is now the past, or the work that I like is now considered part of the past. But I'm thrilled that, you know, people are looking at it and hopefully building, you know, taking it forward in terms of, you know, the political and cultural conversations that we're all engaged in somehow. that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for these reflections. What I heard from what you all said were kind of, Daryl, you mentioning that in tying it into the present day, this sense of progress and of abundance itself may or may not be the way that it gets historicized in the future. That we are talking about, there's this sense in the current cultural conversation that a lot of advancements that have happened within the last 10 years comes to Asian American filmmaking being accepted by the mainstream because of the particularities of the current pandemic year, that might be how it's remembered. Is that what you're saying? And you're drawing a connection to the abundance in the 80s that is quote unquote overlooked today?
Well, one of the things that I'll say is that let's say the period of the late 80s, when a number of young filmmakers were, very Asian American independent filmmakers were working, and a number of them got grouped together. They included Greg Araki and Roddy Bagawa and John Moritsugu and Ria Tajiri, and they began to, work in many ways independently, but it was interesting to see the sort of like trajectory that people had. Another person was Rico Martinez. The reason I say that is because it's like, the path for independent filmmaking, even if you were white or, whatever, still was very difficult. There was no real interface with independent filmmaking and the industry. I mean, it was very tenuous. But what's so interesting is that carving out different careers. I mean, I have to say this. One of the things is that there was very much an emphasis on academia. I mean, a lot of people taught, and through teaching, they were able to also continue their filmmaking practice. I'm thinking of people, quite frankly, I'm thinking of someone like Ria, wound up teaching, and then she also would every so often would be able to marshal resources and create another work, or someone like Roddy Bagawa. Some people have actually worked in the industry in different ways. I was very surprised when I got notices from Rico Martinez that, have I been watching this thing on MTV? This was like in the mid 80s and I mean, mid 90s. And I'm like, why? And it's like, I'm one of the producers. And it's like, really? You wound up being part of the MTV thing where they were doing all those series. And so that's what I mean. It's like Rico this year, he's working he's one of the producers of the Selena series on Netflix. So that's what I mean. It's like, this is how you go. But everybody, has surprised me in doing this. One friend, Cheryl Dunye, started to direct. It was like, it took her so long, but she started to direct things for TV, things on Oprah's network and Queen
one
Sugar.
of the Queen.
Yeah, and things like that. And it's like, so I'm always really amazed that, these things actually happen, that people are finding ways to work in the industry. And it was very, very difficult, but now I'm not saying that it's going to be easier, but it's more, there's more, shall we say, opportunities. And yet we have to also take into account the fact that there was a recent, study about representation in terms of Asian American characters on television and in movies. And they found that it had stalled at like 3%. Even in this year, it's like, it's still 3%. you're only going to find 3% Asian American characters in any sort of regular television series or whatever, even though in many cases, in terms of urban situations, like these series are set in an urban environment, and yes, there are more Asian Americans that are living in the cities. But it's like, but you don't see that reflected in the actual commercial television landscape.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about here, and that is the abundance, perhaps, of filmmakers making work today, continuing to make work today, that there's still, quote unquote, a problem or issue. But I would like to sort of pull back a little bit and talk kind of more about the specifics and mechanisms by which, you know, work gets shown and people's careers do get supported so that they can, you know, go from point A to making experimental films and then end up on MTV. Like, how does this happen? And because the success stories are easy to consider and to think about and to point to, but there's also many people who have felt left behind or who have found it to work within these spaces. So so there is this book that Visual Communication produced in 1991 called Moving the Image, Independent Asian Pacific American Media Film. That is sort of the first kind of broad in these spaces, curators, programmers, and filmmakers. Includes many people who are here today listening to this conversation. So thank you 20, 30 years ago for this book, because to me it's a really interesting archive. But at the time it wasn't necessarily an archive. Contemporary musings on what was happening. And in that book, Daryl, you wrote, quote, "When I have brought up this fact of many of these experimental artists within the Asian American media community, I have been taken to task for bringing up obscure filmmakers. But isn't it when the Asian American media community would say such a thing about Asian American artists within the larger context of the American media industry? Asian American isn't obscure." So what does this mean about the importance? Like, how do we classify, claim, make space for each other? I'm curious to hear your reflections on whether or not, like, this, what's happening.
Okay, well, one of the things I'll say then is that when I wrote that, I remember the fact that, shall we say, there was a very real emphasis on positive images, on the idea that if we were going to be present in the sort of media landscape, we should be presenting something that was positive. So that it was almost like we were reinforcing the idea of the model minority. And for many young people at the time who were working, they weren't concerned with being model minorities or whatever. They weren't concerned with sort of representation. They simply wanted to present things that they were interested in. In terms of that, it was like things like if you're interested in punk rock, which a lot of people were at the time, it's like you wanted to present that, and that didn't necessarily mean that you were going to find a positive Asian American representation within the punk rock field, you know? So those are the kind of things that I was talking about. It was like there was really, and there were sort of these more, shall we say, traditional Asian American media organizations, and they wanted to reinforce this idea of a positive image. And then you were finding young people who were not interested in that at all, because they were coming from art schools where they were told that you were able to do whatever you want, even in terms of being outrageous. For example, many art students, especially women, knew that there had been a whole sort of trajectory of very, very bold art by women that was very transgressive in terms of presenting female imagery that was very sexualized and that was very specifically done by women and not in terms of, shall we say, the male gaze. And that was, you know, something that I know, oh God, there was a film that was done, it was a short film by Gloria Park. And it was one of the most outrageous movies I've ever seen. And I can't remember the name exactly, but it was like, oh, and she was one of the students at UCSD who also included Roddy Bagawa and Rico Martinez. And she was one of their classmates. And it was, it had to do with menstruation and a girl's decision to do something about, like, oh my God, I can't be embarrassed every month by this bleeding thing. And it was pretty outrageous. And Gloria is one person who, well, she then went to Hawaii and started trying to do other things. And you know, basically she dropped out of filmmaking scene. But that's what I mean. It's like, there's always somebody like that, but it's like, at the time she did one of the most outrageous things I've ever seen. And everybody who saw it was like, oh my gosh, how can this girl do this? And that's what I mean. It's like, you know, if you look for it, you'll find that somebody really wants to do something really outrageous. And that's what always excites me when I look at things and try to find like new films or filmmakers, is somebody really taking and going over the edge.
So if I can jump in, I think what's sort of, okay, I think in terms of the emphasis that, you know, pop culture, outside culture puts on experimental filmmakers is that you're kind of expected to aspire to a kind of commercial acceptance or commercial success, right? I think you began with, you know, a quote from Theresa, and I think what was so amazing about her, and who knows what would have happened, you know, if she'd gotten to live more of her life. She did so much before the age of 31 when she was, you know, when she was murdered. But what was remarkable about her, I think, was her insistence on not aspiring to this kind of you know, mainstream acceptance. You know, she truly was radical in that she, you know, I think if she had been commercially successful, she probably would have, you know, gone into hiding or something. I just feel like she was truly independent in a certain way. That is still not really acceptable. I mean, it's still like, you know, if you're a experimental filmmaker, it's still like, well, eventually though, you know, you'll want to make feature films in a certain way, and you'll want to make, you know, these kind of traditional measures of success, right? But I think there are, you know, I think what is interesting about your project and about looking at the past is like, well, what about the makers that do not want to do that, you know, that reject that as a model, and who maybe continue working in obscurity? I don't know, because I don't know what work they produce, but they make their own work, and they do what they do according to how they think, and the you know, just their aesthetic and their political commitments, or so, you know, whatever it is that moves them to make work. But it's not necessarily about sort of conforming to this again, this push towards a traditional notion of success. So I think that's what I find super interesting about the field. And we talked a bit about Prismatic Ground, you know, a new experimental film festival. But I feel like, you know, that, and maybe Abby, you can expound on that a bit more. But I think that was exciting to me because it seemed to expand the pool of filmmaking, you know, experimental filmmaking genres that can be shown and can be shown publicly, but in a different, you know, in a forum that we're not that used to anymore. If that makes sense. Brian.
I mean, I totally agree with this notion that I feel like part of the problem is that we need to find more terms in which we can value experimental film beyond just how it might change the course of mainstream film history. Like, if you think about like the way that the French New Wave is talked about as, and therefore we have Tarantino, or like Kenneth Anger, and therefore we have MTV, right? Like that's not in the spirit at all. And so this is a reminder then that like formalism only goes so far in thinking about what is experimental is just form, but rather it's also about certain kind of institutional practices and certain kind of politics. So yeah, and I think that's where we have to value experimental beyond just it looks different or sounds different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ravi in chat made a comment about, you know, the indie to Marvel cinematic universe pipeline. And I think this idea that experimental film or independent film is only good because it allows filmmakers to make films cheaply, and then to, you know, be claimed and then paid for mainstream success. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions then about the, you know, of Marvel and of commercial cinema. For instance, hiring Daryl, since you mentioned her in conversation, hiring filmmakers like Cathy Yang and Chloe Zhao in order to make films, in order to better in places like China, for instance. This is perhaps also an expression of American imperialism, of being able to export to other countries. And is that a project that we as Asian Americans, whether or not we claim this term or not, is this a project that we want?
Well, one of the things I'll say about that is that, you know, these are the kind of things that are always problematic because right now in China, there's been such a backlash, certainly in terms of Chloe Zhao, and in terms of her not being considered properly, shall we say, Chinese, according to the very specific dictates that the government is now trying to define as what sort of proper Chinese artistry is. And so she's gotten a lot of pushback from official Chinese channels about her work. So it's like, so what this means for Marvel in terms of marketing the Eternals in China, we'll have to see how that works out, you know? But it's like already it seems like there's a problem there. And maybe they hadn't thought that there would be a problem, but there is. But the other thing is that there's always that kind of idea that there, you know, how do I say this? That the experimental filmmaker may someday have a commercial success. This started really in the 1940s, not with experimental filmmakers like, you know, Maya Deren, but actually with Jean Cocteau. It was like Beauty and the Beast wound up being a huge success worldwide. And Jean Cocteau did not ever claim to be a commercial filmmaker. I mean, he just wanted to make this movie, and he wanted, it was this fantasy, and he wanted to make it, and he was able to find people who were willing to back him because he was a very famous artist in France. And, there were people who were willing to put money behind them. So, it was like, wow, extravagant. And then it became a success. And then he followed it up with Orpheus, and that became a worldwide success. And it was like, wow. And then he decided, man, this is not, trying to make a movie, this is getting too difficult. So he just sort of abandoned that. Actually, Jean Renoir once said, why did he stop? He did make Testament of Orpheus, but he said, why did he stop? He could have gone on. And it was like, nah, he figured that was it. It was like he did what he wanted in film, and he went back to, writing plays and novels and other things. But it was like, no, this is too, it was too much. But he did it. And so he was the first one who had been an avant-garde filmmaker who had worldwide success. And then it's like, this is supposed to be, the trajectory. And it's like, I don't think so. It didn't happen. And it also didn't happen because with people, because it's like, quite frankly, talking about Theresa Cha, I should also bring up the fact that, there were a number of women who were working very theoretically at that time. And one person, of course, was Trinh Minh Ha. And she's gone on and continued to make, her films and videos in the way that she wants. And it's like, there's no commercial possibility of her work crossing over, but it's like, but she's sustained her career. Of course, she's very theoretical. She's written many articles and books that deal with the whole idea of sort of the Asian diaspora in terms of the, larger currents in the world. And so it's like, no, you can continue to do that. If you don't expect to ever get a commercial success, that's fine.
It does beg the question then, where do these works show, and why do we care? If we take, for instance, Brian's invocation that, we shouldn't value those of the experimental forms for their future commercial potential, even if the filmmakers themselves do not feel pressured, like Mina has to make work in commercial form. Trinh Minh Ha, I feel like her work is valued because it's shown at a lot of museums, it's taught in film festival courses, things like that. So there is this sort of distribution apparatus for her work, even the commercial theater, for instance. And Brian, Daryl, Mina, you all have worked as programmers and curators, creators for this type of work. And I just want to bring everyone's attention. Brian is currently hiring at PAC Arts for staff. And in the job description, PAC Arts wrote that they want to imagine and build worthy of the most forward-thinking Asian American filmmakers, especially the culturally homeless, too undisciplined, eccentric, unmarketable, ethnic, or visionary for the usual professional tracks provided by cultural spaces or diversity initiatives. So Brian, you creating a space for this type of work. Mina, why have you done this in the past?
Well, I will say, like, I'm constantly haunted by the words of Daryl Chin, right? Because everything that Daryl said, if you read Jun Okada's book, a lot of Daryl's criticism in the 1980s is in many ways a criticism of Asian American media organizations, of which I work for one now, and the ways and how quickly these kind of organizations can become a certain kind of home, and we claim to be a home for a certain type of filmmaker, but anytime you claim the home, you have to acknowledge that there are those who may not feel like they have a place in your home. And so this idea of like cultural homelessness is one that we have to constantly think beyond kind of the cultural boundaries, even political boundaries that we use to define our own organizations. It's interesting, like I wrote that job description with and not thinking about experimental film, right? I'm like, in terms of all these adjectives, right? They're ones that's a spirit that I want to see in commercial films, or commercially aspiring films, genre films, documentaries even. And so part of it was written as a challenge to ourselves to constantly think about like which boundaries do we still need to keep pushing, maybe that we've gotten too comfortable in at the Pacific Arts Movement. And I would say, like, to all Asian American media centers, that's hopefully a question that we need to constantly think about. And again, I attribute a lot of that to Daryl's inspiration back in the 1980s.
Yeah, well, one of the things I'll say in terms of that, going back to the 1980s, what happened in 1986 was very simply that we were coming up to the 10th anniversary of the Asian American Film Festival, and Marlena Gonzalez, who at that time was the program director for the Asian American Film Festival, realized that there weren't many films. And yet, that was a time when film schools were having all these, annual shows and that sort of thing. And every time something like, let's say, Brown University or Cal Arts or UCSD would post lists of like, these filmmakers had won this award, these student filmmakers, you always found Asian American names. And it was like, why aren't they coming to these organizations like, Visual Communications, and to the Asian American Film Festival? We really had to think of that. It was like, I was saying, look, there's these filmmakers. Why aren't they coming to us? And so that year, before we hit 1987 and wound up with the, the 10th anniversary festival, and we had a few films, but it's like there weren't that many new filmmakers. So what happened is within the next year, we went and contacted every school we could think of, a lot of filmmakers, and said, do you know young filmmakers who are Asian American? And it's like, and what a lot of people would tell us was like, oh, but they're making things that you wouldn't be interested in. And it was like, why are you saying that we wouldn't be interested in? It's like, no. We would be interested in these people. And over the next 2 years, we identified at least something like about 50 filmmakers and video artists because at the time there was a separate video festival before everything sort of merged. So there was the Asian American Video Festival, Asian American Film Festival, and we really tried to show as many of these films as possible. And we found out that really a lot of people thought that the media organizations were too traditional and that they wouldn't be interested in their work. And so we had to make this effort of saying, yes, we are interested. Yes, we do want to show this work. And so we had to be proactive about it. And I think that was one of the things that made me feel very sort of protective of these people who are making things, because it was like, oh, they felt like if they showed up at these festivals, they wouldn't be recognized or they would be rejected. And so you didn't want that to happen. And that's what I mean. It's like, I felt like that also when there were films that I was finding people had, it's like, well, why hasn't this been shown a lot? And it's also every so often the cycle repeats itself. And I know that there are filmmakers in the last, say, 5-6 years who've come up, Asian American filmmakers, and they haven't really found like that much shall we say, traction within the traditional Asian American media community. And so it's like, that to me is also another interesting thing, because it's like, oh, people are making things that aren't sort of dealing with identity politics, shall we say. And so you have a lot of other films, and so they're trying to find other venues that will actually accept them. And that's what's interesting also, is that there are a lot of venues now. And something similar happened in the mid-90s, because quite frankly, a lot of the big media organizations, things like, let's say, the New York Film Festival, I can give that as an example. I had no idea why they were rejecting a lot of the films from Taiwan. They wouldn't show any of them. I mean, this became a big thing, and finally Richard Roud was ousted from his post as the director of the New York Film Festival because of this, but he wouldn't show anything from Taiwan. He wouldn't. It was like he dug in his heels. He was not going to show. So the Asian American Film Festival wound up showing all of the early films of Edward Yang, every single one, up to and including A Brighter Summer Day. We also showed early films by Hu Zhaozhen, though I have to say that Hu wound up being discovered by Larry Kardish and Adrian Mancha, and he was included in New Directors, New Films. And it was like, well, of course, you know, since I used to work there at Modern Art, I used to work for Larry and Adrian. So it was like, yeah, they picked up on Hu. And I'm trying to, and Tsai Ming Liang. We showed his first films because they wouldn't show them at the New York Film Festival. And then suddenly they did change. Richard Roud did leave. He retired after 25 years. And Richard Pena came in, and they became really aggressive. And it was like, oh, now we can't show any of these people because, you know, they're going to be shown at the New York Film Festival. But
yeah,
that was a real eye-opener. It was like, am I crazy? I think Edward Yang was a good filmmaker. I think The Terrorizers was a terrific film. Why wasn't anybody else showing it?
I want to say, John, a whole bunch of people are cheering you on, Daryl, in chat for, you know, calling out these kind of big institutions that earlier kind of Asian American institutions have done, right? Who gets just, when does a filmmaker get discovered, for instance? And it speaks, I think, to kind of the power dynamics of, you know, why it's also, I don't know, it's what's going on here? I'm curious, Mina, Brian, Mina, if you want to give your analysis on.
Well, I don't know. I'd actually like to go back to, you know, first just saying to Daryl, I really appreciate the, you know, the fact that you did have to be proactive and actually look for people. It's sort of the excuse, you know, when people say, oh, you know, why don't you choose more women, or, yeah, well, we can't find them. You know, that's always the excuse, or why can't, you know, so the fact is that we do have to be more proactive. And I think when I was at Outfest, which I was a programmer there for a couple of years, I really was very interested in presenting films that I thought were, films and videos that I thought were anti-hegemonic, you know, that were really questioning power structures, that were really politically active, that were, you know, questioning notions even back then of white supremacy, right, by Asian, South Asian, African American, mostly US-based filmmakers. And that was I thought that's what Outfest was about, was in being queer. I thought my thinking about it was that, oh, they will champion this, right? But I was, sort of disheartened at that time to find that, oh no, it was very white, it was very male, and okay, they were gay, but they wanted to be normal. I mean, they wanted they accepted the power structures that are intact in our society, right? They weren't questioning them. They didn't want BIPOC makers necessarily. They didn't want questioning of, certain issues. And so the experimental part was pushed and pushed and pushed until I just felt, look, I've got to leave, because I can't get on this bandwagon of saying, oh, yay, our society is great and we just want to join you and be gay in that setup, right? So I was coming from a very different place. And I found that also in a lot of even smaller collectives. I mean, VC has been amazing, I think, in that they have always championed, alternative ways of looking at the world and presenting, alternative films and not pushing this hegemonic sort of aesthetic and cultural context. But I think I have been involved in groups where, a South Asian group actually, where there was very little class consciousness, or very little, again, questioning of, race and representation, and especially class representation. I find that class is really something that is omitted in a lot of discussions. And I think that's the prism that I view things mainly, apart from race and culture, is class. And I find those conversations missing even in film. And so that leads up to a lot of other things. So I've forgotten your original question, but I think that sort of plays heavily on me now, and it's still, one of my reasons for wanting to make films is still to present that sort of underdog viewpoint perspective. I don't want to join the mainstream, I don't want to join a certain hierarchy as it is now. What I think is interesting about the present moment, though, especially with BIPOC and queer filmmakers, is that more people are questioning the hierarchy we live in. And there is more critique, and there is more, much more work being made that is kind of working towards a social justice, right? And towards more opportunity and more equality. And so that's what I find really exciting about this moment, that I think was missing in the early 2000s and late 90s. So that's my speech.
It's totally inspiring to hear, Mina, you talk about like the behind the scenes at Outfest. And I think it's a reminder that festivals themselves are places that are trying to figure it out too. And that there's so much discussion behind the scenes about one's values. And it also makes you really value those who are able to make change within these organizations. And I think at a moment like that, I just want to definitely shout out that like VC is where I first watched like Mingyu and Esma's films. Caam is where Caamfest is because of Chi Hui Yang in particular, like the work that he's done throughout many years.
Yeah, definitely.
And sometimes it takes just these people with that sense, with that passion for experimental, and filmmakers will find them, and audiences will find them, and at least that's what I believe in as somebody who works at a festival.
And Quentin Lee too. I mean, he, I think Caam, when Caam was Nata, they really championed his work too, and that was remarkable, actually. I think there have been with Nata and Caam and VC. I think we've, and in New York as well, of course. I think we've been lucky to have those spaces.
Yeah. So we do have a question in the Q&A, and we have 10 minutes. If you have any burning questions, your time is limited. So from Michael Kinomoto, we have a question that is about the practice. So we've kind of waxed lyrical about the work that multiple curators have done in the past. But there is this sense that I hear from been hinted at, in that, with the rise of quote unquote mainstream success of filmmakers, that there seems to be a sense that there's even less appetite now for work that may not want to be commercial or want to, acceptance. So Michael has a question that kind of generalizes this conundrum a little bit. Maybe not necessarily just that it's something about Asian media centers, but about the present moment. So Michael's question is, do our panelists feel like there is ironically less appetite for challenging work with radical styles in today's age of instant gratification and access? If so, why?
I think maybe we romanticize the past's appetite for experimental film. I think it was a struggle then, and it's a struggle now. If anything, I feel like the instant gratification probably presents us more opportunities to actually find stuff. I mean, like, what my students talk about TikTok like experimental film, and I'll trust them on it. I haven't really dived in deeply enough, but if anything, like, I feel like there's a lot of room for optimism now. And earlier before this, we were talking about Prismatic Round too, as also this like a festival that I feel like could only have existed in this time of instant gratification, that was able to bring a lot of experimental filmmakers to the fore.
I tend to agree. I mean, I think there is a lot more, certainly in the documentary field. You know, if you think of, especially, I think African American filmmaking as well. You know, you think of County, This Morning, This Evening. You think of Time, which was just nominated for an Oscar. You know, there are a number of others. You know, Kevin Jerome Anderson's work. There are a number of filmmakers now who really are experimenting with form and are finding ways to get it in, you know, after my big spiel about not wanting to join the mainstream, but they are finding audiences with an appetite for this kind of more lyrical, deeper, more questioning work. So I'm really encouraged by that. You know, I don't know if there's the funding for it, but I think once once funders and distributors realize that there is an audience for it, you know, rather than going to distributors and saying, you know, can you make a space for this? I think it's about us making the work and then showing that there is an appetite for it. It's kind of flipping it around, right? So kind of forcing distributors and funders to say, hey, no, this is the work, you know, that is out there that will have maybe not a gigantic audience, but it will have an audience. You know?
I think there's always this kind of retrograde, it strikes me. There's kind of this retrograde explanations that are always applied to things like, oh, you know, if in using one for another, for instance, oh, Hale County is successful, therefore, you know, the next quote unquote experimental film will be successful or not. But panel conversation on PBS and public funding, there were people in the chat reminding us all that PBS was extraordinarily experimental in the
Yeah, that's true.
Right, from Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied to films like Camille Billups' films being broadcast on POV, and I'd say is far more challenging and provocative in terms of the ethical conundrums that it presents compared to something like Hale County, which, as much as filmmaking, kind of operates in an observational vein, for instance. And Brian's, you know, was all that not to remember the past with rosy lens, because a lot of the filmmakers that have been mentioned are in our line with vision. They have spoken over and over again, Daryl, about how when you brought them out to New York for Asian American Video Festival, hated their work, and they were being yelled at during Q&As and told that they were bad Asian Americans for making this work. So, but that kind of response, I feel like, is another type of community response. It forged bonds of steel, it sounds like, for these films.
Yes, and it's also the sort of thing where there were always very surprising things that happen. For example, when the video festival, Asian American Video Festival, was sort of ongoing, we began to get a lot of work that was very much centered on, shall we say, sexual politics. There were many gay filmmakers that were using video and creating work. And it did cause a problem because it was like, well, is this the, like sort of traditional things where people were saying, is this the kind of image you want to present? In other words, gay filmmakers or gay video artists or whatever. And so that was one of those things where you just sort of dug in your heels and said, yeah, we're going to present it. And if there wasn't going to be an audience at that time, it's like, well, that's okay. We want to be able to say that this is available and that people can see these things and can see Asian, actually Asian Canadian, Asian American, and Asian filmmakers who were presenting this kind of work about their sexuality. And so that was fine. But it was like, no, it was another one of those things where I didn't realize there was going to be a fight. I was like, whoa, this is unusual. And the other thing is that sometimes you have different perspectives and it's very challenging and sometimes very funny. I remember when there was a program of experimental films from Japan. This was in the 1980s, and it lasted for a while. There's a very active experimental film scene in Japan. And I remember showing it to a group of students when the Asian American Film Festival used to have programs that traveled. And I remember going to 3 different places, and we were showing some of these Japanese experimental films. And I was asked by one student who said, why aren't they dealing with racism? I was like taken aback, and I finally said, well, because these films are from Japanese filmmakers who are living in Japan. And I don't think they're experiencing racism the way you're experiencing racism by being an Asian American in the United States. And it's like, oh, they didn't realize that. It's like, you didn't realize that if you're in Japan and you're making a Japanese, film, it's like, you're not going to feel racism? This is very unusual, because it's like, it's as if the experience of being sort of Asian American was so universal. And it's like, not quite. There's, and it's the type of thing where people didn't realize that. And there are other things like that that have come up that were always very, very unusual and very interesting. And it reminded me that this is years ago, a few decades actually. Toni Morrison was on a talk show, probably it was Charlie Rose, and she was talking about what she felt was an impertinent question, which is somebody asked her, and it was one of these very prominent cultural critics, when are you going to stop writing about race? And she said it really took her back, because she had to think, what does that mean? And she realized that what it meant was that she was expected to, shall we say, go mainstream. And mainstream meant you were going to write about white people. And it's like, why would she want to? Why wouldn't she want to write about her experience and the experience of, shall we say, those around her? Why wasn't that as valid as the experience of a white man? And that constantly, I thought of that since I saw that program, I don't know, sometime in the 1980s. I thought of that constantly when I'm dealing with people trying to say, why is this film like that? Often what they mean is that why, for example, Wong Kar-wai is a big example. Why is his films not about certain social things? And it's like, well, he's making his films in Hong Kong for what he presumes is himself and his audience. And those are his concerns, which happen to be, you know, about crime or, you know, these outsider people and so on and so forth. But it's like, it's not about what you think is should be his social issues.
Yeah, we have to take care not to an exceptionalism to our readings of other films from around the world. Absolutely. So we are coming upon the, but I don't want to leave us without giving a space for Brian to make any last offerings that to make. I want to acknowledge also in chat, there is a discussion also about the term experimental film. And yes, we've been using it very loosely to a lot of things. So I do want to acknowledge that that is an issue and a problem. Thank you, Valerie. But any last offerings, Brian and Mina?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on Abby, what you just said, there's a distinction between experimental and, say, like art cinema, which has its own other kind of institution involved, and that is actually quite embraced by like the mainstream criticism press. All at the same time, it's sort of like, and this back to like Robbie's point in the chat, which is like, we want all of this. we want to see Asian American filmmakers succeed in all of these areas. I mean, including in the mainstream too, but we also have to say like that there are folks who and they're trying to sustain careers too, working in these other spaces. I think that's what we're focusing on today. Art cinema, yes. Thinking about filmmakers like Patrick Wang and Christopher Yogi, but like experimental being sort of this other thing of its own that we have to consider the specific challenges of sustaining our artists that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, really agree with that. And just the other problematic term, of course, is Asian American, but we won't get into that now, I guess. But it, you know, it's so all encompassing. So of course there's a solidarity there, but then, you know, it's also covering up a lot of differences. So just to bring that up at the end.
Absolutely. So thank you for those offerings. Also, just another offering. So thank you, Jasmine. And before I hand this off to Sapna, because I saw also people asking if, you know, Theresa Cha or Trinity Minha's work will ever be POV. I just want to give a shout out to the work that the people who have been programming Theresa Cha's work recently. This includes Julian Ross, who is a programmer at the Rotterdam Film Festival, who has been called Hyphen in conjunction with magazine on Theresa Cha's work. The British Muslim filmmaker Rahana Zaman, film inspired by Theresa Cha's work, entitled Tell Me the Story of All These Things, which is a really film that incorporates surveillance footage and really kind of takes Theresa Cha's work to deconstruct hegemonic language forms as a way of structuring her work. I would call it, you know, experimental with a capital E, but also filmmakers like Ru Cho, who is in post-production on a documentary about Theresa Cha's life and work. And I think we're gonna give it film because you can donate to it right now if you want to see Theresa Cha's work spotlit, perhaps on POV one day. So thank you, Ashley, for dropping that into chat. And thank you so much, Brian, Mina, and most of all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. I think we're going to throw it back to you, Sapna.
Thank you so much to our panelists for this incredibly thought-provoking, enlightening, necessary conversation. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Brian, Mina, and thank you so much, Abby, for putting all of this together. Do check out the Line of Sight Conversation series. There's much more exciting programming happening. There's one on June 16th entitled Tailgating the Future. I also wanted to thank our ASL interpreters. Thank you so much to Tisha Riley and Patty Lassard. This is our last Caam Filmmaker session. So please remember to check. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being a part of all of the Filmmaker Summit sessions. It's been incredibly enlightening and really enriching to be in community with all of you. Thank you so much for always coming back. Thank you all so much for all of the feedback, and thank you so much for making this community what it is. We couldn't have done this without you, especially in the last couple years. This is the last summit session. However, remember that we have a couple more days of CAMFest programming online. Check out camfest.com. We also have a fabulous closing night party hosted by filmmaker HP Mendoza, and he'll be launching a virtual animated musical from his new album called Folks. That's Folx. And that's it, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here with us. Be safe and be well.